In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about the role of language in our life.
When the Big Five was first invented or discovered, depending on how you look at it, as I mentioned briefly as well, it was brute force statistics, basically. So the idea behind the Big Five is that it's called the Lexical Hypothesis. And the Lexical Hypothesis is that because human traits are so important to us, because we want to understand ourselves, and perhaps even more importantly, we want to understand other people, and because we have language, there's a reasonable probability that we've encapsulated the structure of human personality within our language. And so, if you analyze the linguistic representations properly, then perhaps you can extract out the central personality features. And that's basically what the lexical hypothesis is. And it's important to know the lexical hypothesis. And it's a bit more sophisticated than that, because it basically presumes that you can extract out valid information about personality from adjectives, descriptive adjectives, from phrases and from questions, and you'll get the same basic dimensional structure regardless of which of those techniques you use, and that turns out to be true for all intents and purposes. Now, the lexical hypothesis depends for its validity on the initial claim that personality is accurately represented within the structure of language. And so one of the things I would say is that there's a weak Big Five hypothesis and a strong Big Five hypothesis, okay? The weak Big Five hypothesis is that insofar as you use language to describe personality, personality has a five-factor structure that's reliably extractable. Now, the strong Big Five theory is that no, personality has a five-factor structure and it's accurately represented in language, but when you pull out the structure from language, what you're pulling out is actually representative of genuine personality. Now, the weak hypothesis is, I would say, it's established. And it's worth knowing, because what it means is that if you invent a questionnaire that has anything to do with self-description, it might be self-description at multiple different levels of analysis, like values, for example, and instead of just adjectives, or attitudes instead of just adjectives. I mean, these categories are sort of unclear. What's the difference between your attitude and your temperament? Well, it's usually defined by the sentence that you use the words in, right? You extract out the words, they sort of stand there alone. It's very difficult to clarify their meaning. Anyways, the lexical hypothesis, I think, is one of the most well-established, it's one of the most well-validated claims in psychology. I think it might be the most validated claim, apart from maybe the work that is extracted IQ out from cognitive questions. And basically, it was brute force statistics. People developed different lists of adjectives, and you can complain in some ways about how they did it, and we'll talk about that later. But because they tried to throw out the evaluative words like good and evil, for example, those aren't in the Big Five. So they tried to only use adjectives that didn't necessarily seem to be like highly or like valued or devalued. So introvert and extrovert, well, they're opposites, but is it better to be an introvert? Is it better to be an extrovert? It's like, well, it's not obvious. So all the words that cover that dimension can be kept in because there's no value judgments associated with it, and the originators of the Big Five theory wanted to keep it as free of values as possible. Now, that's already a hypothesis, right? It's a hypothesis that you can come up with an accurate description of human personality even if you eliminate all the words that are clearly valenced. And we did an experiment here a while back that was pretty interesting. We got hold of a data set of descriptive adjectives, and we put all the evaluative words back in. So, like nasty and horrible and awkward and cruel, and then the good words as well, moral, pleasant, uplifting, all of those things. And then we had people rate people they liked and people they didn't like using that expanded list. And we got a real archetype in some sense of the hateable person, and a tremendous number of the words that were used came from the evaluative dimension. So I think that when you throw out the evaluative words, you actually throw out a lot of what people actually use descriptive words to describe, because, you know, whether you like someone or don't like someone, if someone's likable or unlikable, that's pretty important phenomena, you know. I mean, you hang around the people you like, generally speaking, and you don't associate with the people you don't like, so it's a fundamental choice. But we'll talk about that later, because there's reasons that happened, and the reasons were valid, and it's not that easy to fix it. And besides that, the standard 5-factor model has all sorts of utility. So, but you need to know what its strengths are and its limitations are. Now, hypothetically, what you do to draw out the 5-factor model is you take, imagine the set of all descriptive adjectives, okay, and then you take a random sample of those descriptive adjectives so that it's not biased. You're not going to use all of them because, you know, if you ask someone to describe themselves on a questionnaire using all the adjectives we have that describe personality, they'd be there for like a day, and so that's not very efficient. So you want to take a random sample. Maybe you only sample the words that people are most likely to use. So for example, if you go online, you'll find that there are word frequency tables, you know, and most of your language, about 500 words covers about 80% of what you say. So, you know, and I don't remember what the lexicon of the typical person is. I think it's in the neighborhood of 3,500 words, but that might be wrong. But there's like 750,000 words in the English language. You know, it's an omnivorous language. It just pulls words in from all over, and so you hardly use any of those words. You know, and there's ones that are used extraordinarily infrequently. So what you could do is you could look at the total set of adjectives, and then you could pull out, you know, identify the ones that are used, you know, the 1,000 most frequently used words, and that probably cover 95% of the territory. And then you could pick out random set of 100, and then you could administer it to people. And then you could factor analyze it. You'd administer it to lots of people. Then you factor analyze it, and you get 5 relatively clear and stable factors. And the one that comes out first, so it's the dominant factor in some sense, or the easiest to measure, or maybe the best represented in language, or something like that. It's extraversion versus introversion. And extraversion is a positive emotion dimension. And it's associated with enthusiasm and assertiveness. And assertive people will say, they'll dominate the conversation with language. Or well, that's about the right way to think about it. Enthusiastic people, they're up for anything. You know, they're the ones that are always smiling and telling jokes and having parties and that sort of thing. And generally, extroverts really like to be around people. So they're happy, they're gregarious, they're assertive, they're enthusiastic, they're noisy. They blink more than introverts. Now, why that is, I have no idea, but apparently they do. So if you notice someone blinking a lot, you can assume that they're extroverts. If they're not conscientious, like, you know, there's this idea of people being impulsive. It's a very badly defined term. So when you hear a psychologist talking about impulsivity, the first thing you could realize is you don't know what the hell they're talking about, because probably there's no such thing as impulsivity. But extroverted people who are not very conscientious tend to, that's one of the things that you might think about as associated with impulsivity. There's all sorts of other things though too. So